Welcome to the Imagine Athena podcast. My name is Candice Holdsworth. Today on the podcast, I had the great pleasure of speaking to the Mail on Sunday columnist Peter Hitchens, one of my go-to writers and thinkers. We discussed how simplistic moral narratives are used in political discourse to conceal harder, more complex truths about the world. Did Britain really attain the victory it set out to in World War II? Is Britain's relationship with the US a lot more adversarial than the two countries like to admit? And can Trump really make America great again? The two books he mentions are The Deluge by Tooze and The 11th Day, the full story of 9/11 and Osama bin Laden by Anthony Summers and Robbyn Swan. Hi Peter. Did Britain really win a moral victory in World War II? Or was that merely a story we told ourselves to conceal the harder truth that we had really lost everything?
Well, to say that we'd lost everything is a bit much, but we had actually lost the thing that we went into the war to save, which was Britain's position as a great power. It's fairly certain, I think, if one goes through the manoeuvres of the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary between late 1938 and late 1939, that what they had decided to do, and particularly Halifax, was that at all costs we were going to try and establish ourselves as continuing to be a great power by challenging Germany. And that's why we made a guarantee to Poland, which was bound on any careful examination to lead us into war. The end of the war, of course, found us no longer a great power, with almost all our wealth stripped away, and the Americans pretty much insisting that we dissolve what was left of our empire. So if we went to war for that, which I think we did, then we lost the purpose for which we went to war. In fact, by May 1940, we had lost the war that we had started. But fortunately, largely because of the English Channel, we weren't then invaded and occupied. But I think we didn't lose everything. The French lost everything. We lost almost everything, but we managed to maintain our territorial integrity. We weren't invaded or occupied by a hostile power.
Do you think America would have emerged as the global superpower if it hadn't been for World War II?
I think inevitably the United States was heading that way, but I think it would have taken a lot longer. For instance, here's a statistic which amazes most people when you tell it to them. But the United States Army in 1940 was the world's 17th biggest between, I think, Portugal and Bulgaria. The US had a very big navy, but otherwise, much of which was quite elderly, but otherwise it was not a major military power at all, and the navy was largely at that stage a defensive force, not particularly a power projection force, except maybe in the Pacific. What the Second World War did was hugely accelerate the development of the United States as a world power, and hugely accelerate the decline of Britain as a world power. And it was, in any case, the second installment of the First World War, which started, started the acceleration. If there'd been no First World War, if Britain had stayed out of the First World War, Britain would have remained a major economic, military, and imperial power for a lot longer than it did.
You said in one of your articles that possibly there could have been a conflict between Britain and America.
Well, there was a conflict between Britain and America, except that it never actually came to war. The astonishing negotiations at the Washington Naval Conference in 1920 had been preceded by occasions on which British and American naval officers had almost come to blows, I think in the fringes of the Versailles Treaty negotiations, over the growing demand of the United States for what was effectively parity with Britain as a naval power, and the pressure on Britain, for instance, to withdraw from her alliance with Japan, which at that time secured our position in the Pacific. And it's easy now to work out just what a huge difference it made for us to cease to be Japan's ally, and for the United States to be increasingly the dominant power in the Pacific. But these things happened without actual open warfare. But if you read Tooze's fantastic book, The Deluge, and some of the accounts of discussions between American diplomats and British politicians, and of Woodrow Wilson's visit to London, the extraordinary hostility and desire to show Britain who was boss that was expressed by Americans quite openly at this time comes as something of a shock to those who believe that it's always been a great friends, we're all cousins, shoulder-to-shoulder special relationship. It absolutely hasn't been. There was another occasion in recent times when the two countries nearly came to blows, which was over Suez. And I recently made a radio program in which I produced a recording of Admiral Arleigh Burke, who was the U.S. Navy's Chief of Naval Operations, discussing conversations he'd had with John Foster Dulles about the possibility of using armed force to stop Britain intervening in Suez in 1956. And it's quite astonishing, again, to anybody who believes that the relationship is universally close and friendly. It isn't. There's been a lot of tension in it, and most of the tension has come over American resentment of Britain's continuing existence as an imperial power, which ended finally and forever and sank without trace in 1956.
Yes, that was an excellent program. It really opened my eyes because, I mean, for my whole life I've just been told there is this special relationship between the US and the UK, and then you actually see hard evidence.
Like so many things that everybody thinks or everybody knows, it turns out not to be true on examination. But people believe things because they want to believe them rather than because they're necessarily true.
Britain and America have been fighting these wars in the Middle East, which are often for romantic reasons, moral reasons, heroic reasons.
Well, they're portrayed in that way, but it isn't necessarily so.
Yeah, exactly. Just turning to contemporary politics slightly, the Libyan intervention was another example of this, where people imagined a grand moral purpose rather than grappling with... Very
much so. I remember there was an episode of Question Time which I was on. At the time, an allegation was being made that I think Gaddafi's troops were engaging in mass rapes. And I cautioned people against necessarily believing this because it sounded to me like pretty standard wartime atrocity propaganda. And I think anybody who examines it now will see that there was no basis for it, in fact, whatever. And people were being told that our intervention was to save people from massacres, which never took place and which I don't believe were ever seriously contemplated. So the intervention in Libya, whatever its purpose was, I've often wondered why we were so keen to overthrow Gaddafi. But whatever its purpose was, that was a pretext, an ostensible pretext rather than the real reason. And I just think whenever you hear this kind of thing, you should reach for your caution and say, well, if people are trying to rush me into a war on this sort of basis, I should be very careful. The same thing very much took place in Syria, where most people still believe, for instance, that the Assad government used poison gas against Syrians in Damascus. I've searched and searched and searched for any kind of objective, testable proof of this, and there isn't any. And in fact, it always seemed to me I have absolutely no love or sympathy for the Assad government and can prove it, unlike most journalists. I'd written critically about it many times in the past. But it just seemed to me that it would have been mad for President Assad to use gas against the rebels against him, because that had been the precise red line which President Obama had drawn, saying if he uses gas, I will intervene. And the last thing which Assad could have wanted would have been American intervention. Any possible military advantage from the use of poison gas, which I can't think would be very good or very great, would have been lost by the American intervention, which would have followed. It didn't make sense. It would have been a mad thing to do. Actually, oddly enough, one of the reasons why gas, which was a great obsession of the middle of the 20th century as a weapon, has not been much used, is because in war it's not very effective.
In terms of thinking about these things, it's very, very oversimplified, and people tend to think of things almost childishly, like goodies and baddies, and they don't think of it in terms of interests. What would, like you were talking about, it would not be in Assad's interest to do that. Instead, people think he's evil, he's capable of anything, he could just do anything.
Well, of course, and that also means that we imagine that we are not capable of evil. So, for instance, our support for the Saudis in their current adventure in Yemen, in which the Saudis have often done atrocious things, is rarely, if ever, mentioned in the mainstream British media, and goes uncriticized. There is this good versus bad thing, and also you see it affects quite prominent people. And Prince Charles, for instance, recently in his Radio 4 Thought for the Day, started going on about the Second World War as having been basically a crusade to save the Jews from the Nazis. Well, if it had been, it would have been a failure because we didn't save at least 6 million Jews from the Nazis. But the truth was that it never was any such thing. We didn't go to war to save the Jews. There was never any part of our war aim. And when it was plainly brought to our attention by incredibly brave people who smuggled the truth out of Central Europe in the middle of war and tyranny, when it was quite plain that this was going on, the Allied powers decided to do nothing about it. Either militarily, they wouldn't bomb the railway lines to Auschwitz, or politically, they didn't take any steps to try and make it possible for more refugees to get out. There was an extraordinary conference in, I think, Bermuda, which pretty much rejected any attempt to do this in the middle of the war. So it just simply isn't true that this was our war aim. It so happened that when we won, we prevented the killing of more Jews than had been murdered. But that wasn't our aim or our intention. But yet, most people believe now, looking back on it, the war has been reinvented as a liberal crusade against a wicked regime. And again, we have to forget while we do this that our principal ally, without whom we would have lost the war in Europe, was the Soviet Union, which was a wicked regime. It's always hard to make. I don't have a wickedometer. I can't say whether Stalin was more wicked than Hitler or whether Hitler was more wicked than Stalin. They had their own different characteristics, but both of them were certainly hideous secret police tyrannies which engaged in the mass murder of their own populations. And it's very hard to claim that a war in which your principal and vital ally was such a state that you were fighting a moral combat.
Are you writing a book about this? I'm sure I heard you say.
Yes, I am.
When's that coming out? Do you know?
Well, I hope to deliver the manuscript in September. With a bit of luck, it might be out in the spring. But these things are always subject to the unpredictability of life. I could be snatched away before then. Who knows? But that's my plan at the moment. But don't necessarily rely on it.
That'll be really good. So think about.
Well, I hope so. It won't make me very popular, but I just the reason for writing it was that I grew. It was really during the Iraq War propaganda. Yeah. That I felt that I was sick of being told that Saddam Hussein was Hitler and that by implication Anthony Blair was Winston Churchill, and that this was in itself bad. And then I began to wonder whether the model of the good war, which was being used as the example for this, was itself reliable. And I'd been interested. I had a great moment of revelation when I was living in Moscow in the early 1990s, seeing the celebrations of victory in the Second World War, and thinking, the poor, pathetic Russians, here they are, their country is a decrepit economic wreck on the verge of collapse, and here they are still going on about their heroic role in defeating Hitler. And then I suddenly went, Alp, who does this remind me of? Yes. And it reminded me of my own country. And I thought we really do have to reassess this. We've milked it quite enough of its virtue. It's become a pseudo-religion.
It's interesting when I talk to people who've grown up in Russia as well, and it's quite odd because they think that they won the war, and I'm not saying they didn't.
Well, they're right, they did. This is the problem. Although they began the war as almost allies of Hitler, and certainly very cooperative neutrals, they ended it as the victors who had wiped out Hitlerism, and I do not think that the war against Germany and Europe would have been won had it not been for the Soviet Union. And I say this at the same time as I say the Soviet Union was one of the most hideous tyrannies ever to disgrace the face of the earth. But it's true. The Soviet people, and one has to use the word Soviet these days because the Soviet Union is not the same as Russia, the Soviet people fought with incredible ferocity and doggedness and determination, and after they finished defending their own territory, they then fought a very, very savage battle into the heart of Germany. And had they not done so, I don't know how we would ever have managed D-Day. I mean, D-Day was a fantastic achievement, and my father was present at it. I yield to no one in my admiration for all who took part in it. But had it not been for the Soviet Union engaging the main body of the Germans for several years on the continent beforehand, I don't think we'd have found it so easy to get ashore, and it wasn't easy to get ashore.
Yeah, and I think the Allies rarely give them credit for it. I mean, throughout my whole education at school, I don't think it was ever suggested that Russia was victorious in any way. We were
Soviet Union, not Russia. You must distinguish between them, otherwise you get into a terrible mess about the present day. Likewise, I have to say, in the First World War, that the fact that we went to war in alliance with the Russian Tsarist despotism in 1914 is often not mentioned either, because again it confuses the supposedly heroic crusading aspect of the war which we're taught to believe in. You know, we're supposed to have gone to war for plucky little Belgium, when in fact we went to war for Tsar Nicholas. It's not the same thing, is it?
No, it's not. And I think that this is the story of our time. The 21st century is thus far, for me anyway, because I've grown up with it, has been defined by these, very ill-conceived wars in the Middle East, which have been built up in this big romantic way and then have turned out to be complete disasters.
Well, one of them wasn't. The initial war to remove Saddam from Kuwait seems to me to have been entirely excusable under international law and to satisfy certainly in its aims, to satisfy the requirements of a just war. But the conduct of it wasn't necessarily so. Some of the effective massacres of Iraqi troops which took place in that war were horrible to read about, and probably needless, and the disgraceful call by some Western leaders on the Iraqi Shias to rise against Saddam Hussein, which merely led to their massacre, was also, I think, inexcusable. But I think the removal of Saddam from Kuwait was a war which I still think reasonable and supportable.
Yes. But not the second Iraq war.
No, the second one was completely without. It simply did not pass the test of just war, and to this day, I'm not entirely sure what its serious purpose was. There may have been one. I think that the constant worry about Saudi Arabia and what may happen there, and the desire perhaps to have control over the country with the next biggest oil reserves in the region might have had something to do with it, but I can't really think of any good rational explanation for it which fits the facts of how it was brought into being.
Right. What do you think about Afghanistan? Because people often say that was justified.
I don't know why. I'm absolutely not sure why. There's a huge confusion in people's minds between the Taliban government, which obviously most people in the West don't like, and the shelter which they gave under rules of hospitality and honor, which they cleaved to people who have later been generally associated with and said to have been behind the September the 11th attacks. I'm not wholly convinced that the origin of the September the 11th attacks was a cave in Afghanistan. I think they may have had another origin, but it's very difficult to discuss that because of all I can say to people who want to look into it is to read absolutely the best account of the September the 11th attacks in a book called The 11th Day. The authors of which I can't instantly remember, but the title should be remembered enough, which seems to me, and this isn't some kind of truther book, it's a very, very serious piece of investigative journalism. This does seem to me to suggest that the origin of the September 11th attacks may not actually have been Afghanistan. So I don't know. I can't. The Western and Soviet interventions in Afghanistan seem to me to be equally unjustifiable. There were an awful lot of misery, grief, and long-term trouble was undoubtedly caused by the Carter-Brzezinski effort to drive the Russians out of Afghanistan. This is the Soviets, to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and indeed by the events described in that brilliant film Charlie Wilson's War, where the Western powers recruited and trained jihadis to remove the Russians, with long-term consequences with which we still live.
Remember that line, the crazies are pouring into Kandahar?
Well, yes, but it just the fact is that we began something which then turned against us.
Some people think, I don't know if it's paranoid, that the US is trying to start a conflict now with Russia in Syria, and trying to.
I don't. Again, my attempt to analyse this takes me back to Saudi Arabia, which often seems to me to be the heart of darkness of the modern world. That but the United States, since President Roosevelt's meeting with Ibn Saud on the Great Bitter Lake aboard the USS Quincy, has had a genuinely special relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is quite extraordinarily close. And I think Saudi Arabia is definitely behind the attempted overthrow of the Syrian government, which it saw, amongst other things, as a blow at its most hated enemy, Iran. I think the United States, Britain, and France were called in and urged by the Saudis and by other Gulf states to take part in that. I don't, and my own view after some thought is almost certainly that the agitation to move Ukraine from being non-aligned country to a Western-oriented country was an attempt to punish and inconvenience Russia as a sort of revenge for its role in frustrating the Western Saudi policy in Syria. So I think these things are connected. But I don't think there's any coherent desire to start a war. There are just a series of policies which might, if they're pursued without thought or restraint, lead to a war, which is a different thing.
Do you think America's declining as a world power?
Of course it is. All world powers decline. We were taught this in my youth as the wonderful hymn, "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended. The darkness falls at thy behest." How does it go? Thy throne shall never, like earth's proud empires, pass away. And any Englishman singing that in the years when I was singing it felt a sort of annoyed twinge. What do you mean, pass away? Empires don't pass away. Well, of course they do. And the American one will pass away as well. All temporal power passes away. And of course, the United States is still an immensely rich and powerful country, but it's also in very, very serious trouble externally and internally. And it looks rather worryingly as if China will replace it as the major power on the planet, which isn't going to be much fun for anybody when that happens. So it's a matter for regret, but I think it's inevitable the United States is declining. I read yesterday a wonderful article by James Rebanks, the shepherd, about American agriculture, saying he'd visited the United States the first time and had been completely overwhelmed with grief by seeing what had happened to American farmland and how it had been destroyed by following policies of treating agriculture as industry, which he thinks are deeply mistaken. So there's an internal malaise as well as an external malaise, and all kinds of things about America which I love and have always enjoyed seem to me to be fading. It's not the country that it was when I first knew it, and it is in great difficulty. And the election of Donald Trump as president is a symptom of this difficulty. People trying by voting to defy to defy and deny the facts, just as people who look in the mirror and find they're growing old resort to cosmetic surgery and other means to try and pretend that they're not. I think the United States is in that state now, and it's sad and distressing. I think, as with Britain, you can make it worse and faster, or you can make it better and slower. You can't ultimately prevent it, but I think they could try a lot harder to make it better and slower than they're doing.
Do you think people are deluding themselves, thinking that Trump is going to make America great again?
Of course they are, yes. I don't. Apart from anything else, the powers of the President of the United States are very limited. Even if he has the cooperation of both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court and the 50 states and all the other restraints on a president's action, and he doesn't. Or even also if he had a coherent plan. He keeps announcing that trillions of dollars are going to be spent on infrastructure, but he never says where they're going to come from. And I'm afraid that there just is a sense of emptiness of a man flailing about, a man trapped by his own advertising campaign into a position from which there is no real escape. I stick to my view that he will walk out of the White House before his term is over, because in the end his failure will be so complete that the only way for him to re-establish control over his brand will be to leave.
Do you think an impeachment is likely?
I've no idea. Impeachments. I've watched the attempt to impeach Bill Clinton, and I don't know. It's entirely possible that there could be a long, dragging impeachment at some point, but I don't know what about at the moment. You'd have to be living in Washington, D.C. And when I did live in Washington, D.C., I eventually found American political process so tedious that I decided that it would be much more interesting if I just got on a plane or a train once or twice a week and went somewhere else in the United States, because I wasn't ever going to find out anything about the USA by sitting in Washington, D.C. So I honestly, I'm not the person to ask. It reminds me of the great story about Tom Stoppard, who before he was a playwright was a journalist on, I think, the Bristol Evening Post, and he applied for a job on a London paper, and they called him in for interview, and they said to him, Mr. Stoppard, it says here in your letter that you're interested in politics. What is the name of the current Home Secretary? And he looked at them blankly and said, look, I said I was interested in politics, not obsessed with it.
Isn't that why so many in the mainstream media got, the big things like Brexit and Trump wrong? Because they were looking at powerful people and what powerful people are doing rather than listening to what ordinary
partly,
people are saying.
There has been a tendency among, it's very strong in American political reporting, where basically you hang around the White House and you're inside the thing that you're trying to examine, which is always a bad place to be. But there's a tendency, a growing tendency among British political reporters to make yourself the instrument of the government. And far too many of them do that. This is really since the days of Alistair Campbell, particularly, who, in creating New Labour, amongst other things, made it plain to reporters that if they played along, then everything would be fine. If they didn't, they'd be punished. And I now look at them and I think that these people ought to be having their salaries paid by Downing Street the way they report it. They don't really know what's going on. So there is a tendency to become, as is also a problem in Parliament, instead of being a conveyor belt of what the people feel upwards to the government, to become a conveyor belt of what the government wants to say downwards to the people. And I think that has made a lot of political journalism very unperceptive.
Yes, and do you think that's why they've been carried along on these war drums?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Yes, I think they don't. It doesn't occur to them to question it. Also, they don't know enough, and I'm very fortunate. People sometimes say, I agree with everything you say, and I say, you couldn't possibly agree with everything. I say, you haven't lived my life. I haven't. The things that I say are based upon the fact that I have actually visited, I think, 57 countries and lived abroad twice in quite turbulent times, and seen things which no one will ever see again. You couldn't agree with me if you try, but I do have that. I have been out into the cold and the wet a bit, and so many of these people have not.
Yes, I think especially in terms of Russia, I think you do give. I don't think you romanticize Russia at all. Unfortunately, now it's always an either-or question. Unless you condemn Russia, you support them.
It's a positive disadvantage in modern Britain to know anything about Russia, because you have to sit and listen to what you know for certain to be drivel. I mean, I've said before, most people think of Russia as a frightening place full of snow and bears where they use a funny alphabet, and that's pretty much where their knowledge of it stops. And they don't want to know, and because they don't want to know, they pretend that their ignorance is knowledge, and so they swallow everything that they're told. Here is this wicked, sinister Mordor, where the evil one sits in the Kremlin trying to wreck the world. I've been waiting this week for someone to blame Vladimir Putin for the mess up at the Oscars.
Has political discourse always been this childish or childlike?
No, it hasn't. It's partly because of the general decline of educational standards. And it used to be so, and it's still to some extent so, but nothing like as much as it used to be. If you went from the House of Commons to the House of Lords, you went from a chamber in which most people had been educated since the Comprehensive Revolution in the 1960s into a chamber where most people had been educated before then, and when there was still rigorous selective state education, and when there were still proper examinations, when people were still expected to know something. And the difference was huge. There's still a remnant of it. You still come across people in the Lords who still have that measured, thoughtful, knowledgeable approach to things. It came up a bit when there was that ridiculous bill to start bringing in retroactive war crimes prosecutions in this country, which pretty much went against the principle of the rule of law. And only a very few people understood that this was important and were prepared to say so. But they were the educated ones. But no, our education system has collapsed. When one of the things that the grammar schools did was that they kept the whole education system honest. As long as the state sector contained large numbers of rigorous schools in which people were well taught, the level of examinations could be high. And those applied to private education as well, and therefore affected all university entrants, and indeed everybody in the professions who'd had a secondary education. They had to have a rigorous education, but as soon as the comprehensive system came in, which couldn't sustain particularly the GCE O-level, which was a very serious exam, the private schools were able to get away with and rise up in the league tables and get a lot of business on the basis of very poor levels of education. And the state education in the state sector more or less collapsed to a pitiful level. So that look at the difference between language teaching there and now, for instance, an example of this. And so people just don't know anything. They simply don't know anything. You can get I think an A-level now in involving a Shakespeare play without having read that play. And you can get GCSEs in modern languages without having a clue about the structure or grammar or vocabulary of the language. You sort of pass various drilled tests. Education has collapsed, and that is one of the reasons why public discourse is now at such a crude level.
Thanks so much for listening. Please do subscribe and check out our website, www.imagineathena.com. Until next time.